Well, hello again for the last time. Here we are in our final episode. Now, if you have been with us for all 9 of the episodes that has led to this moment, first of all, thank you for all your time and attention, and I hope you feel it's been a wise investment of your time. I just realized this kind of looks like a bizarre episode of Hollywood Squares here, doesn't it? Anyway, if you've been with us for all 9 of these, you'll know that we've seen a lot. And what I want to do in this video is summarize what it is that we have seen and heard, and then talk a little bit about some of the themes that could be explored from all of this. So, what did we learn? What did we hear, see, understand? One of the first things we talked about was this idea of a cloud of shared assumptions. That is to say, if you want to communicate well and accurately and meaningfully, you need to be inside a cloud of shared assumptions. I use the parable of the Blockbuster postcard, and the idea of the parable was to show the absurdity and the nonsense that can result when the cloud of shared assumptions is lost. And the idea is, if I am going to communicate with you and you and you and you, we all need to be inside a cloud of shared assumptions so that the communication can work, so it can be accurate, so that it can be meaningful. Likewise, if the Bible is going to communicate with us, it is up to us to do what work we can to recreate the ancient cloud of shared assumptions, especially when we're studying something as old as early Genesis. And doing that work is called exegesis. Exegesis is the work to understand what did these passages mean then and there. We talked about the exegesis cycle, how you can't help having first impressions, and your first impressions are usually based on your own assumptions and agendas, and can be, without meaning to be, can be a little bit small-minded. And the work of exegesis is to pull us out of our own small worlds and expose us to something other, something different, something new, possibly even shocking. And that's the work of exegesis. And there's a lot of talk about original setting, original context, original intention, that sort of thing. We talked about what I call the Israelite national happiness graph, based on no science whatsoever. Here is the graph. The idea was to recreate the story of Israel, especially focusing on these 2 valleys. Because in the first valley, the valley of the Exodus, this was an empty people, and they needed to be filled up with the good news, with the gospel, the good news about God and humanity and the world, creation. And so God gave Moses stories to tell to the Israelites. And so the stories that we studied in early Genesis had their original context here. We're to understand them as arising in the Israelite consciousness here, as Moses tells them to the Israelites in the first valley. But then in the second valley of the exile, this is when the Israelites had everything and then lost everything. So without land, without king, without temple. Now they found themselves wondering, has God given up on us? Is our relationship with God over? And it was in the exile that these stories brought healing and hope to the Israelites, to the extent that they wrote the stories down in the form we have them today, in this moment, in the second valley. In all of that time, what was normal was basically an ancient Near Eastern understanding. And so we talked about the ancient Near East a lot. Here is the place of the ancient Near East, and down here is the time of it, the negative numbers meaning years before the birth of Christ. And so many familiar names and places are on this map because the entire story of the Old Testament played out here. And so certainly the entire story of Genesis plays out here. And this is the place. This is the original context. And we talked about what this ancient Near Eastern worldview is. And we'll talk about it again. It's so important to keep in mind, because without that as background, without that as normal, you can't actually hear what's abnormal and what's new and what's radical in early Genesis. So what was normal? Well, there were some key points. The gods are poorly behaved. The world is a bubble of protection from chaos, which was represented by the water that surrounds the earth on every side and above. Humanity is a slave class, here to do the hard work to keep this bubble going. And again, in a basically hostile world, the work of the slave humans is appeasement. We are to appease the gods, who change their minds all the time, and we are to appease the kings, who may also change their minds at any time. Appeasement is the best way to keep away the primordial chaos that surrounds us above and below and on all sides. Against that backdrop comes the Gospel of Genesis, and some of the points we saw over and over again is that God is a loving, gracious, forgiving provider of good things. The world is a gift. It is good, and it can be counted on to stay that way. Remember, the flood story ultimately was an anti-flood story. It will stay this way. There is no chaos monster lurking over the horizon. Humans are not slaves, proclaims Genesis over and over again, but rather radically equal, truly free creatures living in an intimate side-by-side relationship with each other. And human freedom should lead to the flourishing of all humans, not just a very few at the top, all. So there should be no kings treating other fellow human beings as slaves. Human freedom should also lead to the flourishing of all creation, and that is very, very clear in the covenant that God makes with all of creation at the end of the flood. Morality is grounded in the eternally good character of God. God's expectations are known and they are unchanging, and that eliminates an awful lot of the anxiety that the typical ancient Near Eastern person would have experienced. Now, the big challenge for us when it comes to hearing all of this good news right here, the big challenge for us, of course, is that our primary concerns are quite different from the ancient primary concerns. And so, left to our own devices, we will approach these stories from the left here, from this column over here. And when we do that, we get ourselves all tangled up in knots trying to figure out how could this be, and things like that. But what we need to do, the work of exegesis, the work of recreating the original cloud of shared assumptions, is to think from their perspective. And from their perspective, these are the primary concerns that drive the stories and even the genealogies that we read in early Genesis. All throughout, when we were studying early Genesis, we looked outside the text and inside. Outside meaning compare it to what was normal in the ancient Near East, look for what's the same, and then look for what's different. And in what's different, it usually there was proclaimed, sometimes quite shockingly, the good news of God. Looking inside the text means looking at the literary structure to get clues for what was considered by the people who put these stories together, what was considered to be the most important points. When we looked outside, again, we saw a lot of contrast. So we saw a lot of charts like this, where you have what was normal on the left and the Gospel of Genesis on the right. I'm not going to read through all of this. If you wish to, you may, of course, pause the video and read it through and be reminded. We saw this in these contrasts in Genesis chapter 1. From Genesis chapter 2, we saw a beautiful pattern emerge when we looked at the contrasts of the ancient Near East. And these I would like to, once again, see unfold because I think they're so important. No other ancient Near Eastern texts explain the appearance of humans like Genesis. It's either they're slaves or they're not even mentioned at all. But early Genesis portrays humanity as being served by God, not servants, but being served by God, being provided by God with not only food, but also beauty, that beauty was important as well. So humanity has been dignified and lifted up in this contrast. And another one. While other ancient Near Eastern texts describe humanity as something like a herd of unpaid laborers, early Genesis portrays humanity as a family that is characterized by, as I said, a beautiful intimacy, that side-by-sideness, becoming one flesh. This is beautiful and intimate. So humanity has been dignified and lifted up in yet another way. No other ancient Near Eastern text accounts for the creation of woman, and I just delight in the fact that the Eden story explicitly portrays the creation of woman as the completion of creation. And so womanhood has been dignified and lifted up again in a shockingly radical way in Genesis chapter 2. And while other ancient Near Eastern texts do include class distinctions so that the value of persons can be ranked and measured, early Genesis will not play that game. And so early Genesis emphasizes the equality, the dignity, and the side-by-sideness of all people. And as a result, those who are traditionally underprivileged have been dignified and lifted up. Now that, of course, is a pattern that we hear throughout the Old Testament and into the New, where all these different ways that people proclaim their joy over the fact that the Lord brings down the proud and lifts up the humble. In all of this, we see, of course, the gospel of Genesis, and that was a theme that came up over and over again, exploring the gospel of Genesis, trying to hear it as loudly and as clearly as the original listeners would have. When we got to all the way through the Garden of Eden story, we started to talk about what is freedom and who gets it, and we discussed the idea that things, when they are in balance like this, allow for the possibility of a life of delight. And in fact, Eden is related to the word for delight. And this minimal restriction here is really quite minimal. That's what the law does for the Israelites. Again, remember, this story first appears in the context of Moses coming down the mountain with the Ten Commandments, and the law, its function is to provide everyone with freedom, and everyone with the possibility to delight in the gifts of God, everyone to flourish in the way that they should flourish. But as we saw in the story, when the serpent enters the scene, and remember that the serpent represents the power of Egypt, certainly in the first valley, and quite possibly the power of Babylon in the second. But when the serpent enters the scene, all the serpent can fixate on is this minimal restriction here, and it is absolutely unacceptable to the serpent, who represents the idea that freedom should mean the ability to do or take whatever you want, from, of course, from those who are weaker. And so this minimal restriction now became the sole focus of the serpent, because it was a threat to the serpent's idea of freedom. But ultimately, what is offered in the Eden stories is this beautiful picture of a garden of delight, that this is the intention that God has for us. What is God like? Well, we saw that God was a loving provider, a beauty creator, a freedom giver, an anxiety reducer, a dignity preserver, that God's laws are minimal, designed only to ensure the flourishing of all people, as we just said. And this is what is so incredible and so beautiful. Even when we are at our worst, and the consequences are dire, we see this when the man and the woman have to leave the garden. They are at their worst. They've done something wrong. They've tried to hide. They're all blaming somebody else. But even at that moment, what is God like? God is loyal, God is compassionate, and God offers protection. God's loving character can be known, and it can be trusted. No wonder we say an anxiety reducer, because you can rest in this. This isn't just good news for the ancient Israelites, as we said, it's good news for all of us. And again, we looked into contrasts, and on the right you see what's new and what's shocking, and this is the gospel. And here's another set. Again, you can pause the videos to read these if you wish. We zipped ahead to the flood story after that, and we saw its structure, and we saw that its structure very, very clearly and blatantly pointed to the central point being that God remembers. What's important about that? It answers, what is God like? God remembers. Nothing can lessen God's commitment to humanity and to all of creation. And if anything, in the story, God's commitment grows. He experiences a kind of character development, so that the I will wipe out becomes never again will I wipe out at the end. God's graciousness endures and grows, as we see in the expanded food blessing at the end of the flood story. It's not just green plants for food anymore, it's everything. Will this world be uncreated by the forces of chaos, by the waters of chaos? And the answer is no. God has full power and will no longer allow it to happen. And that means that chaos cannot impede God's commitment to humanity and creation. So again, so much good news here. And notice that this commitment is costly for God. God is actually willing to suffer for the sake of our flourishing and for the flourishing of all creation. And as we said, this is not just a gospel that's limited to early Genesis. We see this characteristic of God again most clearly in Christ on the cross. This is what is so important about God remembers. It's a love that cuts through everything. We moved ahead to the Tower of Babel and saw that it also had a chiastic structure. It also had a central point and everything else radiating out from that central point. And the point here was, do not live your lives or build your cities in such a way that assumes that God doesn't care or that God must be tricked into paying attention. No, the Lord came down. The Lord already cared. The Lord is already paying attention. This is the kind of attentive covenant partner that we have here. Actually, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. The covenant partner doesn't really show up till chapter 12, but we'll get there. I showed you in the last video how this was a very familiar ancient Near Eastern pattern. You have a set of creation stories and then a genealogy that plows through the generations, then gets you up to flood stories, and then another genealogy that gets you up to so-called modern times for them. We saw that there were longer lives before the flood and shorter lives after. I talked to you about how we are shocked by how big those numbers are, but that the Israelites would have been shocked by how small they are. Because compared to what was normal in the ancient Near East, in normal what is around tens of thousands of years, which was a way of claiming a kind of immortality. And early Genesis just will not allow for that. There's no fuzziness between the categories of God and creatures. No fuzziness whatsoever. Now I'm going to move on to something slightly new. That sort of ends the review part. And I would like to fill this pattern out a little bit and show you that actually this pattern here is what structures all of the 11 chapters that we studied, Genesis chapters 1 through 11. It all fits in this pattern. I'll show you. First, creation. We're going to have a set of creation stories, and then we're going to have a genealogy that gets us to the flood, and then another genealogy that gets us up to modern times. That's the typical pattern. And look how everything we've studied fits in this. First, in the creation box, we had creation story number 1, and then number 2, which had setting, characters, and plot. We had the Cain and Abel story. All of this is inside the Garden of Eden, and then they had to leave the garden, and we had some odd stories concerning Cain and his family, and then we've left Eden altogether. And so then we get to this first genealogy, which I can now expand. The first genealogy is from Adam to Noah. So that covers everything. Notice, if you look at the chapter and verse numbers, we're actually covering everything in order here. Then comes the set of stories concerning the flood. We start with the Nephilim, which gives us a picture of just how bad things were. And one way of interpreting that is that the kings were taking whatever women that they wanted for themselves, and that just showed a kind of injustice and violence, and that was really upsetting and pained God in his heart. Then comes the flood narrative, which is quite long, 3 chapters. And after the flood narrative, a quick blessing on humanity, and then a covenant with all of creation. And then we're told a little bit more about Noah. We have this disturbing story about Noah getting drunk and passing out naked in his tent. And that leads to a genealogy that sort of spreads out and shows, in a way, gives you this picture of how the world, humans spreading out after the flood. But in this, we saw that the disturbing part of the story is connected with Ham, and the descendants of Ham are connected with the typical enemies of Israel. And then we have the Tower of Babel story, again showing how a certain people's way of settling after the flood indicated that they did not understand the truth about God. They had not absorbed the gospel that God already cares. Then that gets us to another genealogy. This genealogy I can expand is from Shem to Abram. Shem is one of Noah's sons, up to Abram, who is, of course, Abraham. And that gets us to modern times, because for the Israelites, modern times, the story of the nation of Israel, modern times starts with Abraham. Abraham is the beginning of the Israelite nation. As I said before, it's never I am the God of Adam, Noah, and Shem. It's always, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is sort of when you might call real history begins, when modern times begins for the Israelites. And I mentioned this in passing, but I want to say it again. It's so important because this is when, in their story, in their history, this is when they start to hear about God making covenants with the Israelites. Now, a covenant is a social contract, and if you're going to make a social contract with someone, you really need to know, what is this person like? What can you expect? And all of this has shown us what God is like. We just explored it again. All this gospel, all this good news about God and humanity and the world. This now makes possible the idea of thinking about a covenant with this God who cares, who attends, who is loyal, who is faithful, who is forgiving. So all of this really importantly sets the stage for the Israelites being willing to think about a social contract with God. Now, other themes that we could explore, there are so many, of course, that we could explore. I feel like we've just sort of started, just dipped our toes in the water here. One of the things we could explore is how our world and our worldview today actually seems so different from the ancient Near Eastern worldview. I mean, we are not shocked. What? Early Genesis is saying that all people should be treated equally, that all people should be free, that everyone should be afforded the same kind of dignity, that we should have a set of laws in place to ensure that everyone has freedom, to ensure that everyone has the possibility of flourishing. This is not shocking to us, and one of the reasons why this is not shocking to us is because our world has been shaped by the Gospel of Genesis. This is why it actually takes work for us to get back inside the normal, quote-unquote, ancient Near Eastern worldview and be shocked again, be renewed in our in our surprise about the radically good news of early Genesis. It's hard for us to do that because we live in a world that has been so powerfully shaped by the Gospel of Genesis. That would be interesting to explore. This saying has come up several times through the video series, when the going gets tough, ... and you know what I'm going to say, but I just want to remind you that the going does get tough sometimes. People disagree with each other on how to read early Genesis and how to interpret it. Some people insist that things ought to be read strictly literally. Others say, no, that's impossible. And these kinds of debates can be very heated. I myself have been, there was someone who wrote into a local publication some years back saying that the way I was teaching early Genesis was, I was saying that early Genesis was a pack of lies. Just in the last month, I've received a couple of emails where someone very politely was trying to say the same thing, that I'm misleading my high school students, etc. And this can be hurtful. And it can also get so heated that it just doesn't do any good at all. And one other thing, and that is that when people approach early Genesis from this side, where they read it as if it were a science report, a scientific report on what happened exactly, in what order exactly, etc., then it can look very much like there is a conflict between what early Genesis is saying about the world and the history of the world and what modern science says about the world and the history of the world. And when there is an apparent conflict, and I say apparent because I don't think we should be approaching early Genesis this way, and so I don't think we should be creating this conflict. But anyway, when there is an apparent conflict, I've noticed two different reactions to this apparent conflict, two different responses. Those Christians that we sometimes call conservative Christians, when they see this conflict, they rightly affirm that the Bible should be authoritative in our lives, that the Bible shouldn't just be this hobby. It should be something that's really, really important and guides us in our lives. And so for them, when they feel like they have to choose between Bible and science, they reject the science. And so they end up making all sorts of claims that are, frankly, impossible to support scientifically, but they even try to set up a parallel science to explain everything in this world and make it reconciled with a strictly literal reading of early Genesis. On the other hand, Christians that we might call liberal Christians, and again, I'm using these words quite loosely. If you're watching this from Canada, that sometimes these terms politically don't really match up the same way. But anyway, those Christians that we call liberals, for lack of a better term, when they also tend to read early Genesis literally, but they're not. But what happens here is, when they see that there's an apparent conflict between early Genesis and modern science, what they do is they rightly say, well, listen, early Genesis was written in the context of the ancient Near East, and all ancient Near Eastern people had their mythologies, and we know better now. So they kind of reject the scriptures. Reject is a bit of a strong word, but it matches the reject over here. They tend to ignore the scriptures that are embarrassing, and so they might skip over early Genesis because, well, that's what they knew then, but we know better now. They were a bit superstitious and primitive, but we are very progressive and enlightened, and so we can just sort of ignore these parts of the Bible that are embarrassing in light of what we know scientifically about the world. But really, I think in both cases, what they're missing with these extreme responses, what's missing here is this idea that no, we need to be thinking about how did these passages express their points then and there. In other words, exegesis. And I think when we get back to exegesis, it really dissolves a lot of these tensions. So when the going gets tough, the tough get exegetical. And I have had many conversations with people with whom I have some significant differences of interpretation when it comes to early Genesis. But then when we can start to talk about how would these passages proclaim good news to the ancient Israelites, there's so much that we share. There's so much that we have in common. So that, for example, Christians who disagree with each other about whether Adam and Eve were literal persons in the past, even though they disagree about that, they can agree wholeheartedly about what the good news in the Adam and Eve story is for the ancient Israelites, and therefore also for us. And so getting exegetical can really dissolve a lot of tensions, and that is another theme we could explore. But what I want to end with is the idea of image bearing, that we humans are made in the image of God. Now, if we're made in the image of God, let's think about God first. And I want to go back to the creation stories at the beginning of early Genesis, and let's think about the verbs attached to God. What do we find God doing in these creation stories? And we find that God is creating, seeing. Remember, he saw that it was good. Knowing, for one thing, knowing that it is not good for the man to be alone, and knowing what the people need before they know it themselves. Naming, he called the darkness night, and he called the light day, that sort of thing. Blessing, be fruitful and multiply, was a blessing that appears several times in early Genesis. Also food blessings. Providing decent clothes for the man and the woman, providing a mark for Cain, etc. Delighting, good, very good, we read in the first creation story. We also, in the second creation story, we have described for us God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. If that isn't a picture of delight, I don't know what is. And finally, resting. A God who can rest because things are good. Really, all of these things are just ways that God is loving. God is a loving God. Okay, now, that's what God does. So here we have a picture of the three important categories as outlined by early Genesis. God, the world, and humanity. God, creation, and humanity. Humans have been set apart because they are image bearers. There's something special about us. And even when we are to rule as image bearers, rule as God does. And I believe we've seen already that ruling as God does means doing a lot of loving. That's what it really means. Well, if we are image bearers, then it makes sense what we see. What are the humans in the Garden of Eden, in the Garden of Delight? What are the humans called to do? Where they are called to work, to care for the garden, to work the garden and care for the garden, to name things that they find in the garden, to taste things, and to appreciate beauty. These are things that humans are called to do. And as image bearers, when we're doing the kinds of things God does, then we are being what we are meant to be. We are being most fully ourselves. So there are so many ways we can think about this. Here's one. Instead of God, think of the great artist. Think of God as the great artist. And think of creation as the supreme art. That is a term I'm borrowing from Tolkien. In that case, we, as image bearers, are part of what we're called to be as the artists in residence here in creation. Or something else, another thing we could explore is being the art appreciators in residence, saying along with God, good, yes, good, good, and very good. There are so many ways we could explore this. As image bearers, we could say, and I'm going to be using some words here that aren't words, just bear with me. We are the creators in residence, the seers in residence, the knowers in residence. I am copying now the verbs that we saw from God. The namers in residence, the blessers in residence, the providers in residence, the delighters in residence, and the resters in residence. These are the things as image bearers we are called to do, because as image bearers we are ultimately called to be the lovers in residence. That is what it means to be fully human, to be the lovers in residence. And so, how are we the lovers in residence as image bearers? And I have here a finite list, and it's a very small list. And so please forgive me if there's something you are absolutely passionate about that isn't on this list. It's bound to happen, but this is not by any means a complete list. But how are we image bearers? Well, we are poets, some of us, and storytellers, and artists of all sorts, right? Visual artists, musical artists, dance artists. We are explorers. We can be explorers physically. We can be explorers intellectually, mathematically, scientifically. We make things. We are makers. We are repairers, which is a kind of caretaking, isn't it? To repair, to make whole again. We are caretakers. We are nurturers. And we are discoverers. Again, scientific discovery, all sorts of discovery. These are the things we do as the lovers in residence. We live in an infinitely interesting world, and early Genesis tells us that infinitely interesting world has been given to us by a God who loves. And so as image bearers, through science and art and poetry, through stories, through acts of love and mercy and caretaking, we are called, when we are fully human, we are called to offer all of creation back to the Creator, delighting in it and saying with God, good and very good. And when we do that, we experience something that does not appear in early Genesis, but does appear in the rest of the Bible. We experience something called shalom. It's translated peace, which is really a rather impoverished translation. But we experience shalom, which means all is right in our relationships with God, with each other, and with the world, with the created world. All is right with those relationships. And when those relationships are all right and rich and deeply good, then we flourish, and all flourish. Well, we have come to the end. I thank you again for traveling with me through these 10 videos, and I hope that this has helped you see that what God wants for you is this shalom, and that the world is good, and that it is a gift from God, and that you are loved. Bye for now.